It was the kind of morning so quiet it felt like it had been muffled by cotton, sunlight slipping in through the blinds in thin, reluctant ribbons, the house still heavy with sleep and silence. I was standing in the doorway of our kitchen, coffee cooling in my hand, watching my husband zip up his overnight bag with the kind of focus usually reserved for surgery or defusing bombs. He moved like a man who had somewhere more important to be than with his family. And maybe I realized that was exactly what he thought. Michael didn't look at me when he said goodbye, not really. He placed a kiss too quickly on my cheek, the same way someone touches a hot stove, just fast enough to avoid consequence. Then one more for Eli, ruffling his son's hair with a softness that didn't match the flat, distracted gleam in his eyes. And then the door closed behind him, like the punctuation at the end of a sentence I didn't understand. I stood there, holding my breath as if listening hard enough could keep the world from shifting. But it already had. Michael had changed. It wasn't just the locked phone he never left out of arm's reach, or the way he'd started sleeping facing the wall like the mattress had drawn a dividing line between us. It was the way he wasn't anymore, the absences that lingered even when he stood right in front of me. 100 little cracks I kept stepping around like broken glass on the kitchen floor. Still, I told myself it was stress. Work. His mother's health. Something mundane and manageable. Something solvable. And then Eli tugged at my sleeve. He was only 6, still small enough that his voice could squeeze through the cracks in your heart and live there. I looked down into those two wide eyes, his father's eyes, but without the cold, and he said, with the seriousness only children and grieving men possess, "Mom, we need to run." I laughed before I meant to. The sound didn't even feel like it came from my own throat. It felt borrowed, wrong. What? I crouched down, brushing his messy curls out of his face. Eli, sweetheart, what are you talking about? He didn't smile, didn't blink. He looked at me the way survivors do in documentaries, right before they say, "I always knew something wasn't right." He took my hand without answering and led me down the hallway. Not to his room. Not outside. To the garage. The air changed the second we stepped inside. It was colder here, sharper, like the concrete floor still remembered secrets and hadn't quite let them go. Eli walked straight to his father's heavy metal toolbox, the one I hadn't touched since we moved in. He reached for the latch like he'd done it 100 times. With a soft metallic click, it opened. What was inside made my knees go weak. There weren't just tools in there. No dusty drill bits, no tangled extension cords, no half-used duct tape rolls. There were 2 burner phones, both powered down. A passport, a small box of memory cards, a gun, and beneath it all, a plain manila folder thick with pages, some of them creased and marked with red pen. Eli looked up at me with those solemn eyes and said, "Dad said if anything ever happened, I was supposed to show you this." He didn't blink. He didn't cry. But I did. I knelt there in the garage, surrounded by the unmistakable evidence of someone I didn't recognize anymore. The man I'd married had built a second life in the shadows of our own, and now, standing here, all I could think was, how long has this been going on? And why the hell didn't I notice? My hands trembled as I picked up the folder, already knowing before I opened it that everything I thought I knew about my husband, about my marriage, about my safety, about my future, was about to be burned to the ground. And I wasn't sure which terrified me more, what I was about to learn, or what my son already knew. I don't remember walking back into the house. I don't remember how I got from the cold cement garage, my knees aching from the weight of that moment, back to the kitchen where the kettle was still humming softly on the stove. I don't remember reaching for the manila folder or the burner phone or the dusty red toolbox with the broken clasp that once held nothing but hammers and bits of coiled wire, at least in my naive imagination. But I do remember what was beneath the false bottom. God help me, I remember everything that was under that false bottom. Eli had stood there, silent, his small hand gripping the edge of the box like a child peering into a pit of snakes. And I had watched, in slow motion, as his tiny fingers slid along the back panel of the toolbox and pressed inward with terrifying precision, revealing not rusted screws or stray washers, but a new compartment I had never seen in all my years of folding laundry 3 feet away. There, laid out like some twisted collector's album, were the photos. Women. Rows of them. Faces I didn't recognize. Eyes frozen wide. Smiles caught mid-laugh or mid-scream. I couldn't tell anymore. They weren't just snapshots. These weren't casual photos taken at a bar or a school event or some office picnic. These were curated. Intentional. Labeled in Michael's handwriting with dates and places, some of which I knew he had claimed to be visiting for work conferences or his supposed monthly check-ins with his out-of-town mother. There were laminated IDs, too. At least a dozen driver's licenses. Some from out of state. Some from nearby towns I could drive to in under 30 minutes. Every name was scratched out with thick black Sharpie, but the faces remained, forever staring up from the bottom of the toolbox like an accusation that had waited far too long to be heard. And then the phone buzzed in my hand. I hadn't even realized I'd picked it up. A burner phone. Obvious. Gray casing, no screen protector, scratched on the edges. Just a string of numbers where a name should have been. No photos in the gallery. No emails. Only the texts. And every one of them was recent. She suspects nothing. Next weekend is clean. I'll need the cash before I move her. And then the last one, time-stamped just 10 minutes before he left the house. Should be done by Sunday. I don't think I breathed for a full 60 seconds. The room spun. The walls, the ones I'd painted myself while pregnant, barefoot and singing lullabies to the unborn child growing inside me, tilted inward, like a coffin lid closing slowly, one hinge at a time. I turned to Eli, who was standing by the pantry door, fingers wrapped so tightly around the hem of his pajama shirt, I thought the fabric might tear. My voice was barely above a whisper when I asked, "How long have you known, sweetheart?" And what he said next collapsed, everything inside me like dry timber under a match. "I saw him take pictures of you sleeping," Eli said, eyes wide, voice hollow and too calm for a child his age. "He said if I told, we'd both disappear like the others." The words didn't make sense at first, not the way a sentence should make sense, wrapped in logic and punctuation and meaning. They hit me like a blow to the stomach, stealing the air from my lungs before I even realized what he meant. Disappear. Like the others. My hands were shaking as I closed the toolbox, slowly, carefully, like sealing a bomb I wasn't trained to disarm. I gripped the folder, the phone, and every breath I had left and turned toward the hallway, willing my feet to move even though my body screamed to collapse right there on the cold tile floor. In the living room, the morning sun was filtering through the blinds, slicing the air into lines like prison bars. It was a perfect morning. A quiet, unassuming Saturday in the suburbs. And I was holding evidence that my husband, my Michael, might not be coming back from his trip to see his mother. Because his trip wasn't real. His mother had been dead for 3 years. He'd buried her in a mausoleum with roses and trembling hands, and I'd watched him cry at her grave with a grief so convincing I'd wiped my own tears with the sleeve of his jacket. Which meant everything since then, every supposed visit, every weekend check-in, every out-of-town errand, was a lie. The man I married wasn't visiting family. He was disposing of it. I sat down on the couch, folder on my lap, burner phone in my hand, and tried not to scream. Instead, I opened the folder. Inside were more photos, more dates, and something else, a printed map with circles drawn in red ink. Circles around places we had been. Restaurants. Parks. A lake house we once stayed at for our anniversary, where I had found a pair of earrings I didn't recognize buried in the couch cushions and convinced myself they must have belonged to a cleaning lady. There were notes, too. Scribbled in shorthand. Names. Hair colors. Heights. Words like routine and clean job and no trace. In the bottom corner of one page was a name I recognized. Claire. My name. Next to it, a date. 1 week from today. And underneath it, scrawled like an afterthought. "We'll need a new plan if she resists." I read it again and again until the words blurred into shadows and my heartbeat was the only thing I could hear anymore. He was planning something. Something final. Something about me. Eli crawled into my lap without asking, his arms wrapping tightly around my waist. I could feel his breath, small and warm, against my shoulder. He didn't ask if everything was going to be okay. He didn't need to. Children are smarter than we ever give them credit for. I kissed the top of his head and whispered, "We're going to be okay." But I didn't believe it, because somewhere out there, my husband was watching, waiting, planning. And I had only 1 week to figure out why. Or maybe, just maybe, 1 week to figure out how to stop him. I packed the go bag in complete silence, not because there wasn't a dozen alarms screaming inside my head, but because I knew if I let a single sound escape, it would turn into a scream I couldn't take back. And once you scream, you're no longer invisible. Once you scream, you're already caught. Eli didn't ask questions. I told him to put on his shoes and grab his favorite stuffed fox, and he did exactly that, with a solemn little nod that broke me more than any confession possibly could. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He just did what I asked, like he'd already known this moment was coming long before I ever opened that damn toolbox. I didn't take my phone. I didn't take my cards. I didn't even lock the front door when we left. We got in the car, my car, thank God, not his, and I drove, hands tight around the wheel, engine growling like it too knew something was wrong. I didn't have a destination. I didn't need one. The only goal was distance. The only rule was gone. At first, the road felt like mercy. The morning traffic was light, the sun too bright, too clean for what was happening beneath its warm, golden gaze. Eli sat quietly in the back seat, hugging his fox so tightly I could see his knuckles glowing pale from the mirror. I couldn't bring myself to speak. My hands were trembling, but I didn't dare stop. If I stopped, I might start thinking again. And I couldn't afford to think. But you can only outrun memory for so long before it starts stitching itself into the shadows of your rearview mirror. At the first gas station, I paid in cash. I grabbed bottled water and dry snacks and a bag of grapes for Eli, and while he ate quietly beside me at a roadside picnic table that smelled faintly of motor oil and wet pavement, my mind started peeling back the years like old paint. And that's when the pieces began falling into place. The first time it struck me as strange was 3 years ago, long before I had any reason to distrust him, long before Eli had even started kindergarten. Michael came home late from a weekend fishing trip with coworkers. He smelled like sweat and forest dirt, and there were scratches along the underside of his left arm, just below where his sleeve ended. He said he'd fallen while hiking down a ridge to chase his hat, which the wind had supposedly blown into the brush. The story felt odd, even then, but I let it slide. You do that when you're in love. You trade instinct for trust like a fool laying down their last card, praying it's enough. Then there was the story about the missing coworker. James, I think his name was. Nice guy. Always wore those thick-framed glasses and brought homemade banana bread to office meetings. One day, he just didn't show up. The police questioned everyone, of course, and Michael said they even searched the entire office parking structure, thinking maybe James had collapsed inside his car. But nothing came of it. No body. No vehicle. Just silence. I remember how detached Michael sounded when he told me. Not sad. Not scared. Just bored. Like he'd rehearsed it too many times and had grown tired of pretending to care. And then, last year, I found the necklace. We were supposed to go out for our anniversary, and I had borrowed his car to pick up dry cleaning. The smell hit me first. Something floral, not my perfume, not anything I'd ever worn. Then I found it. A delicate silver chain with a pale blue teardrop pendant tangled in the lining of his trunk. I held it in my hand for a long time, staring at the shimmer of it in the daylight, my stomach twisting so tightly I thought I might be sick. He said it was for me. He said he was planning to surprise me. Except it was the wrong birthstone. And he never gave it to me. He never even mentioned it again. I threw it away that night, too afraid to ask what it really meant. And now I knew. Those were warning signs, each one screaming louder than the last, each one slipping through the cracks in my denial until today, when it finally broke me open. I was staring down a man I'd shared a bed with for nearly a decade, realizing only now that I'd never really known him at all. We drove for hours. I stayed off highways. I kept the car beneath the speed limit. I avoided traffic cams like they were landmines. I knew enough from late-night documentaries and the occasional true crime rabbit hole to understand how easy it was to be found when someone was looking hard enough. It wasn't until we were halfway through a stretch of desolate back road, where the trees leaned too close to the asphalt and the light turned orange with late afternoon resignation, that I noticed the car. It was subtle at first. Just a dark SUV, maybe charcoal gray, tucked back in the mirror like a ghost in the reflection. It stayed there, 2 cars behind, never overtaking, never falling away. And as each mile ticked by, it remained constant, like a shadow that had decided to wear a shape. The same make and model as the rental he said he'd be using to visit his mother. The mother who was already in the ground. My stomach dropped. I kept driving. Told myself it could be coincidence. Told myself I was imagining things. But every time I turned, so did it. Every time I changed lanes, it mirrored me. Every time I slowed down for no reason at all, it held back just enough to stay relevant, but not close enough to raise alarm. That's when my phone rang. I had turned it off hours ago, battery already drained. But this wasn't my phone. It was the burner. His burner. The one I'd shoved into the glove box like a cursed thing, like maybe if I kept it close enough, it would tell me something he hadn't meant for me to know. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize. Blocked. Private. I let it ring once. Twice. And then I answered, voice tight with dread. Hello. There was silence. And then, finally, a voice I hadn't expected to hear ever again. Claire, honey, why is Michael here asking about you and Eli? It was my mother. Not frantic. Not yelling. Just confused. Her voice floated through the speaker with the kind of cautious concern that only mothers can manage, gentle and sharp all at once. He said you left your phone at home, she continued. Said Eli was sick, that you went to the pharmacy and never came back. Claire, he's worried. Or at least he says he is. But his eyes. I gripped the wheel so tightly I felt the tendons stretch in my wrists. He's not with his mother, I said flatly, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my own voice. She's dead. She's been dead for 3 years. Silence. On the other end, I heard the breath catch in her throat. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to get him out of your house, I snapped, every ounce of fear finally boiling over into rage. You need to get him out now and don't tell him you spoke to me. Lock the door. Call the police. Say whatever you have to say, but do not let him see that you know. The call ended without warning. Not because she hung up. Because the line went dead, as if someone else had killed it. I looked up. The SUV was closer now. Too close. Eli was asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the window, his stuffed fox tucked beneath his chin like a shield against a world that didn't deserve him. I whispered his name. He stirred, eyes fluttering open slowly. We're going to play a game, I said softly, pulling off onto the next unmarked road without signaling. It's called Stay Quiet. Do you remember how to play? He nodded. Good. Because this game might save our lives. I've never believed in instinct as a mystical thing, never thought of myself as one of those people who just knew something was wrong based on a flutter in the stomach or a whisper of bad air. But that night, speeding down a winding road that didn't exist on any of the GPS apps I'd deleted from my phone hours earlier, something primal settled in my bones and refused to be ignored. We were being hunted. Not just followed. Hunted. And the only reason we weren't already cornered like rabbits in a wire trap was because of Eli. He sat in the passenger seat now, by his own insistence, watching the rearview mirror like a soldier, his small hands resting on the dashboard, his lips pressed into a line so tight I thought they might never part again. "Did you disable the tracker?" I asked him, my voice low, steady, careful. He nodded once, solemnly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I saw where he put it. In the wheel well, behind the front passenger tire. "I took it off and threw it into the river last week, just like you taught me how to skip stones." I stared at him for a second too long. This child, my child, had dismantled his father's surveillance like it was a school project. "What made you do that?" I whispered, but I already knew. "Because he started watching us even when we weren't doing anything wrong." Even. That word sat like ice behind my ribs. I turned off the road onto a gravel path surrounded by pine trees tall enough to block out the moonlight. The darkness swallowed us whole. But I didn't stop. I drove until my arms were sore and my head throbbed from the silence. Eventually, I turned into a small driveway obscured by brush and broken signage. The house at the end of the path hadn't seen care in years. The porch was overgrown, one of the shutters missing entirely. But the lights were on inside. I could smell wood smoke. I could see movement. And I could feel the weight of what this meant pressing into my throat like a hand. My sister lived here. Or rather, she had hidden herself here. Her name was Lydia. Once, she had worn a badge, carried a sidearm, kicked down doors with state-funded authority and an instinct for predators that made headlines more than once. But that was before she'd crossed someone with enough clout to bury her career in paperwork and accusation. She'd been my hero once, before the fallout, before the silence between us grew so wide we stopped trying to yell across it. And now she was the only person I trusted enough to open the door without calling first. She answered in a bathrobe, her hair twisted up in a bun, a shotgun casually resting against the wall behind her. Her eyes widened when she saw Eli, when she saw me. "You're early," she said, which was her way of saying you're in danger. "I need your help," I said, and that was the first time I let my voice break all day. We were inside before I realized I was shaking. Lydia made Eli a sandwich and sat him down in the den with a fuzzy blanket and an old cartoon DVD from when her daughter was young. Then she shut the door behind us, led me into the kitchen, and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a chipped mug before pushing it toward me across the counter. "Talk." And so I did. I showed her the burner phone. I showed her the photos. The IDs. The fake bottom of the toolbox. I laid everything out on her kitchen table like a ritual, one piece after another, like building a puzzle whose picture was too awful to comprehend fully. She didn't speak until the end. Even then, it wasn't a question. "It's not enough," she said, and her voice carried the weight of knowing too much. "This looks bad. It feels bad. It reads like a serial offender's diary. But without a body, without direct proof, without witnesses other than a terrified 6-year-old, no department is going to throw the book at a man with a spotless record and a community volunteer badge." I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the warmth slide down my jaw. "There are bodies," I whispered. "They're just not ours yet." She stared at me for a long moment, then stood up, crossed the room, and pulled open an old filing cabinet near the pantry. From inside, she retrieved a battered laptop, a digital recorder, and a flash drive shaped like a silver bullet. "Let's go find them," she said, and it wasn't a promise, it was a declaration of war. We contacted a detective Lydia trusted, someone she'd worked with before the fallout, someone who owed her favors that couldn't be ignored. He met us 2 hours later in a 24-hour diner off the highway, sitting in the corner booth with his badge clipped to his belt and a cup of cold coffee in front of him. I gave him everything. Lydia did the rest. Explained the photos. The phone. The notebook. The necklace. The disappearances. The fact that Michael had used burner devices. The fact that he had lied about his mother. The fact that he had a storage unit registered under his old business name, one I didn't even know existed until Lydia ran his background through a private law enforcement system, still grateful for her silence. 3 hours later, they broke the lock. The unit was small, impersonal, climate-controlled, but inside, it was hell. There were boxes labeled by state. Women's shoes, scarves, jewelry. A diary filled with notes so cold, so calculated, they read more like lab reports than the writings of a man reflecting on past lives. Subject was compliant, but weak-willed. Test failed. Disposed of after 10 days. Subject B showed unusual resistance. Recorded for analysis. Left in Sector 2. No revisit necessary. And photos. Always more photos. Not of violence. Not of blood. But of control. Of women asleep. Of women eating. Of women looking over their shoulder like they felt something watching. One of me. I stared at it for so long the detective finally touched my arm, just to bring me back. But still no bodies. Nothing but implications. Patterns. Ghosts. He closed the door to the unit with a grim shake of his head. It's not enough to charge him, he said, and I felt my lungs collapse inward. But it's enough to watch him. And so they did. They promised to monitor. To follow. To interview. To quietly test the waters without alerting him to the net forming beneath his feet. But all I could think about as we drove back to Lydia's house in silence was how many women had disappeared just like that into silence, into doubt, into the shadows of a man who looked so perfectly harmless, even when holding the matches. I tucked Eli into a guest bed that smelled like cedar and old childhoods. I stayed awake the whole night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knock on the door that might never come. Because Michael wasn't done. Men like him never are. When the call finally came through, I was sitting in the faded living room of a borrowed house that didn't belong to me, drinking reheated coffee that tasted like someone else's regrets, staring out a window that faced nowhere and pretending, poorly, that any of this resembled peace. The detective's voice cracked through the cheap burner phone like a splinter through skin, abrupt and bloodless, delivering the news with the grim cadence of a man used to telling people things they already know but never want to hear confirmed out loud. "Claire," he began, and the weight behind my name told me everything before the facts even started to fall. "We've got him in custody. Michael was arrested this morning without incident, no resistance, no denial, not even a goddamn question asked." At first, I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mouth was dry, and my heart beat too slowly, like it was waiting for permission. Because some part of me, some buried, blistered part that still knew how his voice sounded when he whispered apologies into the hollow of my neck, refused to believe he would ever go quietly unless he had already planned something far louder for later. Michael didn't resist, because Michael never needed to. He just adjusted the plan and watched the rest of us unravel in his silence. "He's being held," the detective continued, "but without bodies, without a confirmed crime beyond possession of unlicensed weapons and some deeply disturbing documentation. The judge allowed him bail." I felt the world tilt, but not in the way a building collapses or a storm takes hold. This was the slow, deliberate unraveling of something you never quite trusted to hold. He was out. He was walking. He had paid his way back into the sun with cash pulled from shadows I hadn't yet uncovered. "They're putting you under," the detective said, his tone softer now, almost regretful. "Witness protection. You and Eli. Effective immediately. New identities. New records. New everything. You'll disappear." Disappear. That word tasted different now, sharper, heavier, and far more personal. I once believed it was something only others experienced, something whispered about missing women and closed investigations and flyers stapled to telephone poles. Now I understood it wasn't a fate. It was a sentence. One we had earned by surviving. We left in the middle of the night, escorted by government agents who didn't smile and didn't explain. They handed me an envelope filled with new names, fake birth certificates, falsified school records, and a prepaid debit card with an expiration date shorter than our memories. The duplex they gave us was beige in every direction. Beige walls, beige furniture, beige air. The town was so small I could memorize every streetlight before I unpacked our single duffel bag. Eli didn't complain, not even once. He simply sat on the edge of his new bed with the same stuffed fox he'd carried through hell, his eyes older than any 6-year-old should ever be, as if he knew even better than I did that this was not safety, it was survival with a softer label. Weeks passed. 3, then 4. I took a job inventorying shipments at a supply store whose back room smelled like fertilizer and regret. No one asked questions, and I gave them no answers. Eli started school again under a new last name, wearing a backpack that didn't belong to him, walking hallways filled with children who didn't understand why he never laughed too loud or played too long. Then, one afternoon, we walked into a cafe. A quiet, dusty place on Main Street with fake ivy in the windows and a television mounted crookedly above the register. We sat at a booth tucked in the corner, Eli coloring quietly with the free crayons and placemat provided by a waitress too young to notice the kind of fear that lives behind a mother's eyes. It was peaceful in a way that felt borrowed. But then the news anchor appeared. Muted. Closed captions scrolling beneath her too-perfect smile like a prophecy already unfolding. I turned to look, and there it was, blazing red across the screen. Breaking. 2 bodies recovered in wooded area, suspect linked to previously investigated individual Michael Grant. I couldn't breathe. Not really. Because in that moment, everything we had tried to bury clawed its way to the surface, covered in dirt and vindication. They had found the women. At least 2 of them. The bones beneath the trees. The missing names scratched into his journal with unholy precision. The journal that, not so long ago, was deemed chilling but not criminal. Eli looked at me. His fingers were stained with blue crayon. His eyes were steady. And then he looked at the camera mounted above the register. I followed his gaze, and I knew deep in the marrow, beneath every layer of the identities they'd painted over us, he was right to look. Because someone would be watching. Someone always was. I raised my face. Not in defiance. Not in pride. In recognition. He would know. He would find us. He had always known how to follow the scent of fear better than any tracker born to blood. And when the waitress passed by and offered to refill our water, I smiled politely and declined, then turned back to Eli, who had stopped coloring and was now just holding his hands in his lap like he was waiting for instructions. I reached across the table and placed my palm over his, grounding us both in the weight of what we had survived. Then I whispered, not for him, not for the camera, not even for myself, but for the things still lurking in the space between who we were and who we had become. He won't stop. Not now. Not ever. I knew it the moment he walked free, and I know it even more now that they've found what he tried to bury. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look away. And then, as the news continued to unfold behind us, as customers sipped their coffee and lives went on without interruption, I said the words that had been festering at the base of my skull since the night we ran. I changed our names, but can you ever truly escape the person who once shared your bed?